2i, that's both a complex number and an imaginary number. But what about 1 plus I? It's definitely complex, but is it imaginary as well? Some might say no, yet many people still would say yes. So why do people get confused? Why do so many people think imaginary and complex numbers are the same? In fact, imaginary numbers are simply a proper subset of complex numbers. The answer lies in history. The definition of imaginary has changed over time. Today, we usually say that an imaginary number is any complex number that isn't real. In other words, all complex numbers except the real ones. We write a complex number as a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers, and I is the imaginary unit, the number whose square equals -1. If b equals 0, then a plus bi is just a real number. If b doesn't equal 0, anyway it includes I. It's no longer real. And that's what we call an imaginary number. But you can often see a slightly different definition on Wikipedia or from Alpha or in textbooks. They define an imaginary number as a complex number with no real part or a real multiple of the imaginary unit I. By that definition, 3i and -2i are imaginary, but 1 plus I and -3 plus 2i are not. That definition is closer to the original, the more pure idea of imaginary numbers. Here's why. It all comes down to the unit I itself. Since I is the imaginary unit, only numbers that contain I alone could truly be called imaginary. You can't form something like 1 plus I using only I. You'd need a separate real component. So it makes sense to define imaginary numbers as either complex numbers with no real part or real numbers multiplied by I. Then why do we define it differently now? If we stick to that narrow definition, complex numbers with no real part, we end up with 3 categories: real complex numbers, imaginary complex numbers, and complex numbers that are neither purely real nor purely imaginary. That makes things more complicated than they need to be. So mathematicians decided to broaden the definition. Now, we simply call any complex number that includes I, that is, any complex number that isn't real, an imaginary number. As a result, complex numbers came to be defined as the union of real and imaginary numbers. And if a complex number has a real part of 0, we call it something special, a pure imaginary number. That's why imaginary numbers can feel confusing. Sometimes it refers only to pure imaginary numbers, and sometimes to all non-real complex numbers. But today, most people use the broader definition. So now you don't get confused anymore. Imaginary numbers exist within the world of complex numbers as one of its 2 pillars. I'll see you on the next math travel, so please subscribe. Thank you.